Hi, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question.
That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello and welcome to We Need to Talk About on GB News with me, Alex Phillips, where we get stuck into the big issues that we need to be looking at in depth. Nothing is off the table and nobody's going to get cancelled here for saying what they think. Keeping me company today is Tom Slater, editor of the news and current affairs magazine Spiked. And here's what we've got coming up on the show. Wayne Couzens is one of 5 murderers who are having their prison sentences reviewed. Are their jail terms too lenient, or should life mean life? We'll have the latest in the Royal Courts of Justice. Plus, rapper and mental health campaigner Professor Green is joining me to discuss how a growing number of us are stressing out over the soaring cost of energy bills. And Brits are heading to the polls tomorrow, and because of last year's postponements, we're getting 2 years' worth of elections in one. Confused? So am I, but don't worry, we'll explain it all. That's what we're talking about for the next hour, but what do you need to get off your chest? You can email me, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or tweet the programme @gbnews. But first, it's time for the GB News headlines with Rosie.
Good afternoon. It's just coming up to 2 minutes past 2. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date on GB News. Now, Boris Johnson says the country is going through a tough patch as a result of the cost of living crisis. The Prime Minister, though, insists the UK is better placed than it was during the economic crises of the 80s and 90s. It's as the cost of our food shop went up 3.5% last month, according to the latest figures from the British Retail Consortium.
The best future for the country is get through the tough patch that we have now, support people in any way that we can. But remember, this is, we're now seeing a lot of employment and people in high-wage, high-skilled jobs. That's a much better position to be in than we were in the 1980s or 1990s.
Neil Parish has now formally quit as a Member of Parliament. It's after the MP for Tiverton and Hoynton admitted to watching pornography in the House of Commons. The Treasury has accepted his resignation. Russian businesses are being banned from using British accountants under new sanctions. The Foreign Secretary Liz Truss says the measures are designed to cut off access to the UK service industry, which Russians heavily rely on. It's part of 63 new sanctions, which also include travel bans and asset freezes for people linked to Russian media. The European Union will stop importing Russian oil and refined products as part of a new set of sanctions against Russia. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says crude oil supplies will be phased out in 6 months and refined products by the end of the year. Von der Leyen's warning it won't be easy, but it must be done.
Putin must pay a price, a high price, for his brutal aggression. Thus, the future of our European Union is also written in Ukraine. This sends another important signal to all perpetrators of the Kremlin. We know who you are. We will hold you accountable. You're not getting away with this.
In other news now, Sarah Everard's murderer, Wayne Couzens, and the killer of 6-year-old Arthur Labinjo Hughes, Thomas Hughes, have both appeared via video link at the Royal Courts of Justice. They are among 5 killers having their sentences reviewed today. Ex-PC Cousins was handed a whole life term for murdering Sarah Everard. Emma Tustin and Thomas Hughes, who killed Arthur, were sentenced for 29 and 21 years. Our London reporter Alice Porter was at Thomas Hughes' hearing.
The case of Arthur Libinjo Hughes in Solihull. You may remember the 6-year-old little boy was beaten by Emma Tustin a couple of years ago and he sadly died. Now, Thomas Hughes, who was the father, he was given a 21-year sentence for manslaughter, but the prosecution want that to increase, arguing that although he was not the person who gave the fatal blow, he was aware of the risk of the very serious harm to his own son. They also said that other children in the home witnessed abuse and that Thomas Hughes also encouraged abuse and cruelty. The defence then spoke on behalf of Emma Tustin because the Attorney General is hoping that her 29-year prison sentence will be upgraded to a whole life order.
German investigators have found new evidence against the prime suspect in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. A prosecutor told Portuguese television they're now sure the convicted sex offender, Christian Bruckner, murdered her. That is something he denies. The 3-year-old vanished during a family holiday in Praia da Luz in 2007. Trade unions are warning cuts to rail funding will endanger passengers and increase the risk of serious train crashes. The TUC claims Network Rail plans to reduce its annual spending by £100 million, mainly by losing 2,500 maintenance jobs. The union believes safety-critical jobs will be cut. The Department of Transport says safety will always be the main priority of Network Rail. The Transport Secretary says the announcement of the opening of London's new railway, the Elizabeth Line, a day before local elections, is in breach of electoral rules. Grant Shapps has referred the case for investigation by the Electoral Commission. The new line will open on the 24th of May. London Mayor Sadiq Khan says he's really excited.
Trains are brand new. The stations are step-free. It will give not just London's economy, but our country's economy a massive economic boost. We think it will contribute more than £42 billion towards the national economy. Really important in this difficult time after the last 2 years.
You're up to date now on GB News. I'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's head back to Alex and We Need to Talk About.
There are crimes where rehabilitation is possible. Ex-convicts who have turned their lives around and become valuable members of the community. But there are others that echo through history for the monstrosity of their crimes. Murderers come legends that inspire biographies and documentaries. Psychopaths who would pose a danger to society throughout their lives, who have committed crimes for which there can be no recompense in law. The list of prisoners with whole-life tariffs in the UK reads like a who's who of infamous killers. Fred and Rose West, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, Dennis Nielsen, Jeremy Bamber, Levi Belfield, Harold Shipman. And most recently, the Islamic terrorist who brutally stabbed Sir David Amess, and Wayne Couzens, the policeman who abducted, raped and murdered Sarah Everard. A whole-life tariff means the prisoner must die behind bars. Today, though, 2 appeals are taking place over the sentences of recent notorious killers. While the Attorney General is challenging what she says is an unduly lenient sentence for the killers of 6-year-old Arthur Libinjo Hughes, his father Thomas Hughes and girlfriend Emma Tustin, following months of abusing the little boy, resulting in his death, Wayne Couzens is attempting to appeal his whole-life tariff. Surely, when pure and unrestrained evil is seen in a human, there can be no salvation. And while in this country we do not punish taking a life, when it comes to sentencing for the most cruel and calculating criminals, life behind bars should mean just that. Well, the sentences of 5 killers are today being reviewed at the Royal Courts of Justice. The murderer of Sarah Everard, Wayne Couzens, is among those having their sentences examined. Our London reporter, Alice Porter, is outside the courts right now. Alice, what's the latest?
Hi there. Yes, the review started by looking at the sentences which were referred to the Court of Appeal by the Attorney General for being too lenient. And they are Emma Tustin, Thomas Hughes and Jordan Monaghan. Now, Jordan Monaghan was given 3 life sentences with a minimum of 40 years in prison for killing his partner and 2 children. But the prosecution say that they want that to be increased to a whole life order, partly because it also involved the attempted murder of another child as well. Now, the Attorney General also wants Emma Tustin, who was responsible for the death of Arthur Lubinjo Hughes, the six-year-old in Solihull, who sadly died with a fatal blow to the head. Now, he had suffered prolonged abuse at the hands of his stepmother and father. The Attorney General wants Emma Tustin's sentence to be increased from the 29 years that she received to a whole life order, and for Thomas Hughes to have his 21 years increased as well. The prosecution said that although he was not the one that gave the fatal blow, he did have an awareness of the risk of the very serious harm to his son, and the other children in the home witnessed the abuse as well. So there's 3 people that are coming forward to have their cases reviewed for being too lenient, but there's also 2 people who are having their cases reviewed to see if they were too high, and they are Wayne Couzens and Ian Stewart. Wayne Couzens, of course, who was convicted for the murder of Sarah Everard and her kidnap and her rape. Now, he was given a whole life order because of the severity of the crime in which it took place as he was a serving Metropolitan Police officer.
Alice, what is the significance of this review?
Well, it's highly significant. It's very rare that we have 5 cases being looked at in this way by multiple judges. And of course, it provokes some very profound questions. You know, should the courts bow to political pressure when it comes to increasing prison sentences for some of the most criminals that we've seen across the newspapers over the last few years? How far should judges take into account the sentencing guidelines, and how much discretion do they have? Of course, this is highly political in terms of when it comes to prison sentences for people like Emma Tustin. There are lots of members of the public who would want a life sentence to mean life. And I think that's a very fundamental question that's being asked in court today. When does life mean life? Although I think it's worth pointing out that whole life orders are actually incredibly rare within our justice system. And if they were to be found to be given out too liberally, it could have profound consequences for our legal system.
Alice, thank you so much for bringing us the latest. Well, let's talk now to Pastor Mick Fleming, a former drug dealer who now dedicates his life to helping others change their lives. Pastor Mick, it's fantastic to have you on the programme. I mean, you've got a very profound backstory yourself. Tell us a bit about how you ended up being a pastor and a little bit of your personal history.
Yeah, so I'm from a background of violence and abuse, sexual abuse of me, and also kind of addiction and crime. And I'm a survivor, and my life has changed through my faith. You know, it's my faith that has served me and turned my life around, yeah.
When you hear of reviews such as this, I mean, it does pose the questions of whether or not some of the most dangerous criminals can ever be rehabilitated, and raises questions perhaps about the motivation that led them to commit crimes that may lead to the prospect of potential rehabilitation. Do you think that rehabilitation, when it comes to things like murderers, is possible?
I think it's possible in some respects, but I think restorative justice is about the families of the victims being able to heal, and the punishment has to reflect that. So the voice of the families and the loved ones need to be louder into situations like we're seeing now, because it's about healing, or at least attempt to come into terms with, and their voices need to be louder. I think it has to be case by case. And I think, you know, obviously we need the professionals, but there's also a spiritual aspect to it. So that healing for the mothers and fathers and the families of people who's been sadly taken away. They need to heal just mentally, emotionally and spiritually as well. And that should be priority. I think that should be an absolute priority from my perspective.
And once we've paid attention to that very important priority, what sort of conditions would need to be met for a decision to be made that perhaps somebody just, ended up through abuse in their own background or perhaps extreme coercion, who ends up committing, albeit an extremely serious crime, has the prospect of being somebody who can yet salvage something from life and give back to the community?
Yeah, I think something can be salvaged from it when people have committed crimes, of course, but that doesn't always mean that that person has to be free. So, people can educate themselves in prison and lots of other different things. Some people can be rehabilitated back into society, but we have to be very, very careful. And we need the professionals wrapping around that. Now, it is possible. But again, I think restorative justice for me is about healing, which is not just physical, so healing. So a lot of the guys that I work with they've murdered and they've come out, they've been lifers and they've come out. So what they do is they never heal. They sort of carry the guilt and the shame, and they end up heavily into drugs and alcohol, which some people might say good, tough, but it puts a drain on society. It costs more money. It leads to more crime. It doesn't work. So it has to be very, very much restorative and carefully analysed case by case. And I kind of welcome the fact that justice can be challenged, but it can be the sentencing in this country can be for some of the more horrific crimes. They don't seem to tally up to me. So, sex offenders, I've seen people get very small sentences in comparison to a burglar. There doesn't seem to be, people are not priority to me in the justice systems. What seems to happen is it seems to be monetary, financial things. I can go and rob a bank and get 10 years, but you can go and hurt a child and get 6 months. It doesn't add up. And I think that's something that needs looking at. There needs to be justice in the justice system.
Pastor Mick Fleming, thank you for your insights on this matter. Fascinating to hear your thoughts. Joining me today is Tom Slater, editor of the online news and current affairs magazine Spikes. Tom, fantastic to have you in the studio.
Thanks for having me.
I mean, what people might say about these particular cases, especially, say, the case of the killers of Arthur Labinjo Hughes and perhaps this appeal of Wayne Couzens, is that politics has come into this. These were big, high-profile crimes that, dominated news headlines when we learnt of them. And perhaps the sentencing at the time for Wayne Couzens reflected that, because it's rather unprecedented for someone who's only killed one person to get a whole life tariff.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, I believe I'm right in saying that Wayne Couzens is the first person to ever receive that for just murdering one adult and it not being part of a terrorist attack. So this was hugely significant. And, there's always the danger that politics has too much sway over the law and over judges. And if you want to change the law, you do that via Parliament. You don't do that by trying to change it after the fact via judges, etc. But I think there are certain cases which are just so horrific that even within the existing guidelines, within the existing rules, those kinds of tariffs are going to be handed down, and arguably Wayne Couzens was certainly one of those. The brutality of that crime. Yeah.
And in the case of the killers of Arthur Labinjo Hughes, his father and his girlfriend, do you think that it is right that the Attorney General is now saying that perhaps those sentences were too lenient, or do you think that also may reflect a political motivation when there are surely lots of children up and down the country who have suffered a similar tragic fate, haven't necessarily made the newspapers and are not seeing this sort of intervention?
Well, I think we need to be very careful about this just becoming a means for political grandstanding, because that separation of kind of politics from the law, it's not neat, it's not perfect all of the time, but I think it's important to maintain that. Of course, there are always these cases which just are so devastating to us, and the case of little Arthur is definitely one of those. But whilst we might want to have a kind of broader debate about what is the correct sentence for a crime as horrific as that, I think separating it out from essentially the Attorney General being seen to kind of order a judge to toughen up the sentence, that can, again, cause problems for the rule of law, I think.
Do you think that there needs to be a sort of whole-scale review of the sort of sentences being handed out? Because as Pastor Mick was saying, sometimes the sentences given to rapists, for example, seem incredibly short for the sort of crime they may have committed, whereas other people, if they're involved in fraud, such as, say, Boris Becker lately, you know, in many respects, he may be serving more time in prison, or at least be handed a sentence for more time in prison, than someone who has abused women.
No, I think that's a really important point, because you see those cases day in, day out, with someone who's committed a horrendous sexual or violent crime getting a relatively short sentence. You know, it's then down to, again, they could potentially be out on half of that still. All of this just strikes people as incredibly unjust. And you have people who are kind of being really over-policed for relatively minor crimes. You know, the people who are locked up for saying offensive things on the internet these days, albeit for quite a short period. And yet, these things which society, all of us claim to care about so deeply, you know, relatively light sentences, a slap on the wrist, it seems like. So that's definitely something that needs to be looked about when we're looking at how the kind of balance of justice in this system works.
Tom, thank you so much for your views. You're with GB News on TV and radio. Coming up, I'll be discussing allegation that men and boys are among the rape victims of Russian soldiers in Ukraine. That's after the break, but first, let's have a check on the weather forecast.
Hello. Warmer weather is on the way, but today's a fairly cloudy one. Quite cool in most places, with some heavy showers, particularly in the east. Meanwhile, many western areas showing signs of brightening up as the afternoon wears on. Here's the big picture. High pressure is trying to move in, but these weather fronts are firmly controlling our weather today, bringing a lot of cloud and shunting showers eastwards. We're going to see one or two heavy ones this afternoon, most likely over northeast England, but also over the Midlands and drifting to East Anglia. The showers over eastern Scotland could be heavy, but they are fading here. Most of Scotland becoming dry this afternoon. Northern Ireland's mostly dry as well, with a fair bit of cloud. Some breaks in that cloud for Wales and southwest England, so a bit of sunshine here. Could see temperatures up to maybe 19 Celsius, but generally still on the cool side with temperatures in the mid-teens. And some quite heavy showers around this evening over southern parts of the Midlands, East Anglia, and one or two across the southeast as well. But those showers do fade through the night, so most places becoming dry overnight. Some patchy rain across the far northwest of Scotland. But for most, as I said, it becomes dry and clear and temperatures will drop down into single figures. A fine day for most then to come on Thursday. Could be a little bit of mist and fog early on here and there. We'll always keep a lot of cloud over western Scotland, rain at times over the Highlands, the Western Isles and the Northern Isles. Maybe one or two showers in southwest Scotland too. But for most places it's dry. Yes, it won't be blue skies everywhere, but most places will see some good spells of sunshine. And temperatures responding, finally getting back up to 20 degrees, maybe 21 across some parts of the south. Cooler feel with the patchy rain across the northwest that persists during Thursday evening. If anything, it gets a bit heavier as weather fronts start to push in during Thursday night and Friday, and these weather fronts will bring some rain across the country on Friday. But after that, high pressure moves back in, and that should bring most of us a fine, bright weekend. Bye for now.
Millions of people across the UK are heading to the polls in a vital test of Boris Johnson's premiership. This isn't just about Westminster, these are local elections. A chance for you to decide how your community is run. We'll be talking to senior politicians, election analysts, our team of reporters around the country, and of course, to our team here in the studio. And we'll have comprehensive coverage of the elections to the Northern Irish Assembly. That's the UK Votes 2022 from 10 a.m. on Friday morning here on GB News, the People's News Channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question.
That's two questions, actually. That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
The first group of civilian evacuees from the steel plant in Mariupol have been taken to safety following months of being trapped underground as the city was reduced to rubble by Russian troops. Repeated appeals to get women and children to safety had been ignored despite desperate negotiations. It was the first time a humanitarian corridor had been successfully established in the southern port city following a complex operation by the UN and the Red Cross amidst landmines and artillery strikes. UN investigations into alleged war crimes have also unearthed evidence of men and boys being raped by Russian soldiers in reports the international body says are the tip of the iceberg. Meanwhile, Russian forces have again struck the western city of Lviv, close to the Polish border, as Moscow today boycotts a UN Security Council meeting, showing a nation increasingly unwilling to compromise or cooperate with a global rules-based order. Any signs that the war could begin to subside seem years away, as Russian ally Belarus also begins ominous snap military drills today, sparking fears they could back Putin's offensive and intensify the campaign. And today, news that Russian troops are storming the Azovstal steel plant despite hundreds of civilians still sheltering in bunkers underneath. Well, joining me now on the show is freelance journalist Stefan Weichert, who's currently in southern Ukraine. Stefan, let's begin by this UN report that there is alleged evidence of the rape of even boys and men taking place in Ukraine. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, it's basically a continuation of these, what comes after the Russian invasion of north of Kiev, the Ukrainian capital. It's a report, which is continuing with these reports that Ukraine also have said, about how now it's also men and boys, but also like small girls and women in general have been raped by the Russian troops when they have been in control of these areas north of Kiev. And it's a story that keeps evolving, because the more that the UN is able to go to those areas, the more journalists are able to talk to civilians in those areas where were occupied by Russia, the more stories about this we've been told, about what has been happening up there.
Now, we also know that around or just under 100 civilians have managed to escape the steelworks in Mariupol, where they've been sheltering for months on end. They haven't seen daylight for that whole period of time, barely had any food or access to water. And I understand that currently it's alleged that Russian troops are storming the steel plants. Can you give us the latest on that?
Well, that's what we hear. Is that on one side, there is a small hope, that we can get maybe more civilians out from there, more women and children, that this humanitarian corridor, which had some success, can let even more people leave. But on the other side, we're also seeing that, the reports about how Russia is at least planning, if not already storming the factory, the plant, so it's a mixed picture. But it seems like the Azov regiment, among others of the Ukrainian military there, are able to withhold, to stand and hold this plant despite being, under siege for more than 2 months now, and without having much ammunition as far as we are concerned. Here, not so much water, not so much food or medicine. It's apparently like completely horrendous conditions that they live in there, where also some people should be buried like on the rumble because of this bombardment that's happening on the plant.
Now, strangely, Russia have seemingly denied that such a storming is underway. But what do you think the significance of this is? Is this to weaken the morale of Ukraine? Because for a long time, the troops have managed to hold out in Mariupol. Or do you think it actually is to target some of the civilians who are sheltering there?
We don't know. But we do know, we heard how Putin said like some days ago how they will not storm the area, how that they just seal it off and let them be in there, and then eventually probably they'll come out and surrender. But what we hear now is different. It is that there is an attack going on the people, on the regiment there. The Ukrainian military is still there, but we don't really know to what extent. But what we do know is that when Putin is talking about that he's going against these neo-Nazis, as he say in Ukraine, he's going against to remove these neo-Nazis or whatever he kind of labels them as, it is the people who are defending Mariupol. It is the Azov regiment, especially in the Ukrainian military, who are holding up in Mariupol that he's trying to get rid of. So, I mean, it is not surprising maybe that he is going to try to get completely control of this area.
Stefan, thank you so much for the update. Please do stay safe. That's Stefan Weichert, who is a freelance journalist and a friend of this programme. Well, still with me is Tom Slater, editor of the online news and current affairs magazine Spiked. Now, Tom, we've spoken a lot in recent days about financial and military aid being sent to Ukraine, 300 million more announced by Boris Johnson yesterday. But we've also just learnt that Liz Truss is adding to the sanctions package, but by this time going after UK companies, legal companies, accountancy firms, PR firms who might have been aiding Russian oligarchs try and avoid the sanctions. Do you think that's the right move for the government to be making?
Well, it seems to be kind of closing another loophole, at least in the midst of all the sanctions which have already been announced, kind of another layer on top. But you do kind of feel like, not just with this country, but across Europe in particular, the big thing being how sped up the sanctions in relation to Russian fossil fuels. It feels like this is going to be the most consequential thing. I mean, it's been fascinating how many companies just left Russia of their own accord when all of this kicked off. Such was the kind of moral and political pressure at that sort of point. So, I mean, anything that might shift the dial is, of course, welcome. But it does feel like it is that question about oil, but particularly gas, which is going to be the thing that might really hurt the Russian war machine most in this particular point.
And in terms of how Britain has responded, I mean, the EU have just unveiled their sanctions against importing Russian oil, which they aim to have in place by the end of the year. We'll see how many countries actually sign up to that. But in terms of the UK response, I think a lot of people would say that we've been the vanguard, really, and leading from the front on this. But when it comes to Ukrainian refugees, we've been found wanting.
No, exactly. It's been crippled from the beginning, from bureaucracy, from failures of the Home Office. I mean, we all know that the Home Office is not fit for purpose. It's been declared that more times than anyone can count. But for the government not to be able to step up, even in this particular instance, is shameful, when I think a lot of the things could have been done. We even saw happening across Europe, just waiving visa restrictions for a year for Ukrainian citizens, not having to have people who are fleeing war present months' worth of documentation and to address again, workers from the Home Office in English in order to try and get over here. A lot of these things have been tidied up as we go, but the fact that the issues with the Homes for Ukrainian scheme, with the refugee setup, are still occurring, I think it's shameful. But in a sense, we knew this was going to happen. This is the same story time and time again when it comes to the Home Office and how they deal with refugees.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I couldn't agree more. You're with GB News on TV and DAB Radio. Coming up, I'll be speaking to rapper and mental health campaigner Professor Green about the growing stress levels over those soaring energy bills. But first, it's time for a check on the news headlines.
It's 2:32. I'm Rosie Wright. Good afternoon. Let's get you up to date. Boris Johnson says the country's going through a tough patch as a result of the cost of living crisis. The Prime Minister, though, insists the UK is better placed than it was during the economic crises of the 80s and 90s. Well, the cost of our food shop went up 3.5% last month, according to the latest figures from the British Retail Consortium. Russian businesses are going to be banned from using British accountants under new sanctions. The Foreign Secretary Liz Truss says the measures are designed to cut off access to the UK service industry, which Russians heavily rely on. It's part of 63 new sanctions, which also include travel bans and asset freezes for people linked to Russian media. The European Union will stop importing Russian oil and refined products as part of a new package of sanctions against Russia. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says crude oil supplies will be phased out in 6 months and refined products will be by the end of the year. Wayne Couzens' lawyer has told the Court of Appeal his client accepts that his murdering of Sarah Everard was abhorrent. Couzens is one of 5 killers, including those responsible for the death of 6-year-old Arthur Lebinjo Hughes, whose sentences are being reviewed at the Royal Courts of Justice today. The Transport Secretary says the announcement of the opening of London's new railway line, the Elizabeth line, a day before local elections is a breach of electoral rules. Grant Shapps has referred the case for investigation by the Electoral Commission. The new line will open in just under 3 weeks. The Met Office says Britain could face a heat wave from around mid-May as temperatures will start to climb from this weekend. The weather, they say, could get very warm later this month, peaking at around 23 Celsius degrees in the south of England. Last month in April, average maximum temperatures were above normal. You're up to date on GB News. We're on your TV, online and DAB+ radio. Stay with us. Alex will be back shortly with We Need to Talk About.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question.
That's 2 questions, actually. That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Having spent weeks trying to justify not putting a windfall tax on big energy firms as they get record profits while millions are plunged into fuel poverty, the government may be forced to backtrack. The previous excuse that further taxing energy giants making billions as world wholesale prices soar would lead them to not investing in renewables has been shut down by the boss of BP today. Protecting profits while impoverishing people looks even more revolting right now, as it has transpired that some companies already coining it in the crisis have been whacking up direct debits far beyond the increase in fuel costs, even using illegal tactics to do so. Some customers are being charged double or even triple their monthly bills, which for families on the breadline means crippling poverty. Firms found playing dirty have been given 3 weeks by Business Secretary Kwesi Kwarteng to no doubt fudge an excuse or be fined. But it begs the question, why this government appears so ready to run to the rescue of large companies, even when the country is in the grip of a spiralling cost of living crisis. Who runs the UK? Boris or big business? Well, I'm joined now by the rapper and mental health campaigner, Professor Green. Fantastic to have you on the show. I mean, let's look at the fuel poverty going on, the cost of living crisis, heating or eating, and record numbers of people having to go to food banks. I mean, how on earth is this acceptable in the 21st century?
I don't think it is, and I think it's great to partner with British Gas to highlight the British Gas Energy Trust and to let people know that there is support available. But I'd much rather not be here having to highlight support being available and people not needing the support. I think I've spent a lot of time in food banks, and the image of the idea people have of who's walking through those doors is not what people would think. And for all the flaunting of figures of record numbers of people in employment, what the government that we have don't tend to discuss is how many of those people are earning their poverty and beneath the breadline, because we have record numbers of people in employment that are existing as opposed to living and are barely surviving. And we're seeing more and more people. There's, an exponential increase in people experiencing debt for the first time. Energy debt, which wasn't a phrase that was coined when I was growing up. It was just debt. And there wasn't, charitable trusts such as the British Gas Energy Trust when I was growing up. And, I grew up with my nan's anxieties around money because of all the stress that existed in our household. My grandmother brought me up. And there was a lot of robbing Peter to pay Paul, being ushered off so as my nan could make an excuse to one debt collector or borrow money from one debt collector to pay another. Fortunately, there are places, and charities providing support for people now, but then you've got to get over all the barriers that people have accessing the support. Pride being one of them, another being language barriers, another being computer literacy or access to a computer. There's so many challenges that people face just to access this support. It seems like there's an easier resolve here, and it should, my belief is that, the bare necessities shouldn't be a luxury afforded to certain people, which should be afforded to one and all, which might seem like a bit of a pipe dream in today's day and age, but it should be a priority.
Yeah, I mean, you are a big campaigner when it comes to mental health, and without doubt, people in debt, people who can't feed their families, there's a huge amount of pressure and strain on them. What is the impact in particular for, say, men who often, you mentioned pride earlier, are very reticent about trying to access help or owning up to the fact that they may not be able to provide for their children?
I became a father a little over a year ago, and people say to me, since I've done all right for myself, well, you're middle class now. I can never be middle class. I will always have my working class anxieties. I can't get rid of them. All I can hope is that my child will grow up differently, but that's going to take a hell of a lot of hard work from me. And having become a father, the idea of not being able to provide for my son, like, everything becomes realer at that point. And it makes me much more focused on getting rid of my mortgage and doing all the things that I can to try and provide a future for my son that's different to the one that, I was afforded. It's scary, the idea of not being able to provide for your family, and, the stigma that exists around being a man and not being able to provide. It'd be incredibly difficult, and it's frightening. And I understand the pride that comes with that and not wanting to open up about needing help. But I think it's really important. Listen, I've been in debt. My money management skills were terrible for the larger part of my life, because I had no real education to speak of, let alone, education as far as money management. And again, to go back to the British Gas Energy Trust, they're there to provide help, not just financial help, but practical help as well if necessary. And I think it's important that people access that help, because it's an all too important education. It's, whether you need help with reducing the cost of your energy, which also has a positive knock-on effect as far as sustainability, affordability and sustainability. They go hand in hand. And, if you need financial help, they're there for that too. But I think more needs to be done, if I'm honest, not least of all by our government.
Now, I'm glad you raised that, because there'll be a lot of people out there who have no idea that there is access to help. Can you tell our audience, if they're watching this right now thinking, I might need to get in touch with that, how they would do so?
Yes, please. If you have access to a browser, search British Gas Energy Trust. They're also supporting a lot of community projects which are able to, which people are able to access that may not be able to access the service directly. So please, if you can, visit British Gas Energy Trust, and you'll find all the information you need there to help you find the support that you need, whatever your problem may be.
Professor Green, it's been delightful talking to you today. Thank you so much for coming on the programme.
Appreciate it.
Well, there you go. There's Professor Green helping us all, well, helping not all of us, but some of us, no doubt, getting support when it comes to energy debt. And there are, of course, other charities and organisations out there trying to help people during the cost of living crisis. Well, let's go back to Tom Slater, editor of the online news and current affairs magazine Spiked. Now, the government for a long time, when pushed by opposition about putting a windfall tax on the energy companies, will come up with a range of excuses. One, of course, saying that, well, if we tax them in this, we want to encourage them to drive those profits into renewables. You had the chief executive of BP this morning, Bernard Looney, coming out saying, well, no, a tax isn't going to stop us investing in renewables. We're going to do that anyway. Surely if the energy companies are that mercurial, and now we find out that a lot of them are hiking up bills beyond the soaring wholesale cost of fuel, we've got a problem here. It seems to me that we have a government completely out of step with reality when people in employment are going to food banks and instead automatically running to the rescue of big business.
Well, it certainly seems like that. You do wonder if there's been a bit of a shift in recent days. We've had Kwasi Kwarteng, the business/energy minister, also Rishi Sunak kind of previously floating this idea. But it was interesting to see how tin-eared you saw Boris Johnson was coming to try and rein that in to the point where he was then again contradicted by the BP boss. I think a windfall tax is not obviously going to help. It's not going to solve the problem, and I think that's part of the problem. Is at the moment is that this is the discovery of a real deep issue that's been in British politics for a very long time, which is that because politicians have been so insulated from the ordinary person, from the British public more broadly, they've pursued energy policies which have made energy more expensive, and that's been something throughout all of these environmental policies, all throughout the kind of hesitancy around fracking and nuclear, although on the latter it's starting to change. And you would hope that a crisis of this scale would shake things up to the point where you would actually see not just some tinkering around their edges with windfall taxes and other things to ameliorate the worst excesses, but actually thinking, how do we create cheap and plentiful energy for all? I'm not seeing much of that. You're just seeing more talk about renewables, which, again, it could be a part of the picture, but is not reliable and cheap enough to be something which can actually transform people's lives. Yeah. Will this shake them out of it? I don't know. Yeah, certainly not a quick fix either. Tom, thank you so much. Well, they hardly inspire the sort of excitement of a big, tasty Brexit vote, but local elections are taking place up and down the country tomorrow. While politics wonks get caught up in treating the results like a barometer of the government's popularity, changes at local level actually have really tangible impacts on our daily lives. So why don't voters seem to care? The stuff you need, use and indeed pay for every day is largely controlled by local authorities. Yes, bin collections and street lighting, but also hospitals, schools, roads, social care and housing. The stuff of life. Yet with so many different tiers of government, from county councils to unitary authorities, mayors to boroughs to local councils and elections at different times in the cycle, trying to keep up with it all is a hard task, even for journalists. Maybe that's why only one in three of us bother to vote. But surely we should care, because tomorrow the power is in our hands. Well, let's speak to none other than Jackie Weaver, who's the Chief Officer of the Cheshire Association of Local Councils. Jackie, you're keen to see more people getting involved in their local communities and perhaps local politics.
Oh, absolutely. And in your introduction, I think you really sort of captured what the problem was, and that is people think it's incredibly complicated, so they kind of just don't get involved with it. But it's really not that complicated.
And, it's confusing, though, isn't it? I think if you ask the average Joe on the street, or even the average political journalist, what each of these particular authorities does, local councils, parish councils, of which you're, of course, famous for sitting on, what the mayor's responsible for, a lot of people just don't know. Can you give us a bit of a cheat sheet?
Well, I suppose the thing is you don't really need to know. You just need to know what you're trying to do. So I guess for me, the simple one, of course, is your town and parish councils, because they are responsible for the things that literally happen on your doorstep. So in your village, in your town, that kind of thing. And then after that, your borough council or unitary authority are They're more about what we call the big ticket items. So again, like the things that you mentioned, like adult social care, hospitals, schools, etc. But for me, the really important one is that ultra local council, your town or parish council, because when you get involved with that, you really can see that you can make a difference.
And very briefly, Jackie, how can people get involved?
Well, you could start by having a look at the National Association of Local Councils website. That's nalc.gov.uk, and look at their Make a Change campaign. Everything you need to know is there, in English, easy to read.
Jackie, you're an inspiration, ongoing inspiration. Always fantastic having you on the programme. Jackie Weaver, none other. Well, joining me today is Tom Slater, editor of the online news and current affairs magazine Spiked. It's funny, isn't it? People can't be bothered with local elections, can they? Yet when it comes to actually voting for people, being able to directly communicate with people and seeing tangible change and tangible effects, that's surely the best place to go.
Well, you would think that, wouldn't you, that it has a kind of direct bearing on your life. People make jokes about bin collections in the state of the roads, but obviously it is quite important. But I think there's a thing where we talk a lot about how people feel distant from Westminster politics. I think even that is the case a lot of the time with people's local councils. They don't feel like they're getting as much out of them. They don't necessarily see these people in their communities as much, and therefore you get much of that disconnect. I think it is kind of part and parcel of that general sort of gap that you see between politics and ordinary people in many respects.
Yeah. Well, would you ever stand?
No.
Don't think I would either. Anyway, if you watch this show every day, you could probably make yourselves a little Alex Agenda bingo card. If I was standing in the elections tomorrow, you'd know exactly what my policies were. Well, let's give it a go. Scribble down the main themes of my rants and count how many you get right. A GB News mug goes to whoever gets a full house. Gallery, roll that sting. Well, yesterday I made the mistake of praising the Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi for taxing energy companies. Good things don't last forever, as the once parachuted in patsy of Brussels has apparently done a screeching U-turn on momentary sound judgment by pushing for a United States of Europe. Not only does he want what he calls pragmatic federalism, which is a creepy way of saying making EU countries pitiful, voiceless colonies, he believes in doing this by imposing joint foreign policy without the need for agreement on who attacks or defends what, and by handing everything from economic to energy decision-making to the faceless bureaucrats in Belgium. So, it's Ciao Italia and its incredible Roman history. Time to join a new empire, mea amici. Just as I'd started learning Italian too. If Draghi has his way, it'll be a quaint regional dialect in a decade's time. Makes me wonder why Britain ever waded into the Second World War when they all seemed to want a German-controlled continent anyway. I'm just glad we got the hell out. Now, with all the mad stuff happening, from the trans-extremist assault on women's rights to all-time lows in rape prosecutions, to the pornification of society becoming a public health crisis as MPs also watch X-rated material in Parliament, and the whole debate on abortion raising its ugly head since America went all Taliban yesterday, you'd wonder how the Women's and Equalities Minister is managing it all. Who even is that, I hear you cry? Turns out it's Liz Truss, who has done a decent job where she can, but probably has enough on her plate when it comes to Ukraine. Oh, I know some of the dinosaurs in the current government thinks women's rights is all woke and stuff, but for crying out loud, society is hurtling towards some kind of biblical dystopia of unbridled permissiveness and unisex toilets, while politicians can't even say what being a woman is, while most mothers still can't afford childcare in order to keep their job. We need someone sensible, full-time across this. Just give Kemi Badenoch the whole role and make it prominent. We women need her right now. It turns out BrewDog are going to give workers 50% of bar profits and shares, which could see hourly wage workers pocket up to $5,000 in bonuses at the end of the year. Good on them. BrewDog may have come under fire after workers had said previously that the company had a culture of fear. But it turns out you can teach an old BrewDog new tricks. Let's hope this sets the tone for other companies up and down the country. Not enough businesses inspire loyal workers by offering options on shares or even share the profits, when it's the lowest paid workers who often toil the hardest and keep the entire operation afloat. And We all like to mock the woke brigade, calling them snowflakes and pointing out their lunatic ideologies. But it's not so funny when a performer is attacked mid-routine by a literal social justice warrior carrying a knife and a replica gun. Well, that's what happened to American comedian Dave Chappelle last night by someone who took umbrage at his jokes about trans women. Gives a whole new meaning to the concept of a concealed weapon. Well, still with me is Tom Slater, editor of Spiked. Tom, anything that you heard there from my jog across the news, the hidden news headlines, let's say, of today that's tickled your fancy?
Well, I think the point you make about women's rights in the midst of all this kind of woke nonsense is a really important point. I mean, it's come up through all the Roe v. Wade debacle over in the US, but it does make you wonder, in a time in which politicians struggle to define what a woman is, how are these issues actually going to be properly fought for and won? And I think that's something which has come crashing through in the midst of the past 24 hours as that ruling's come down.
I mean, it's one of those departments back in the day, wasn't it, that people thought was a bit superfluous, a bit, you know, let's cut it back, let's put it on the bonfire of the quangos or whatnot. But do you think it is about time that we did have a Women's and Equalities Minister? We do have one. It's, you know, a position held by Liz Truss also as Foreign Minister, and I think Kemi Badenoch is a minister within that department. But do you think it's about time that the ministry sort of got revived and given a more prominent role, as I've said?
I think so, because of the fact that I think we've got almost like twin challenges now with loads of different equalities issues. You've got the kind of existing residue of the old inequalities, if you like, in terms of sex discrimination, again, historic impacts of racist practices from long ago and all the rest of it. We've also got this new form of it, this kind of like woke form of it, which is kind of, again, pushing in a kind of discriminatory, divisive direction, but from the left, effectively. So I think someone who can take on those particular issues in a very kind of clear way, who is someone like Kemi Badenoch, definitely, I think could make a lot of progress, because it's not just the kind of old inequalities we're fighting against anymore, it's these new kind of woke inequalities as well, I guess.
Now, sticking with that good old word woke, I mean, the Dave Chappelle incident last night in America is quite chilling, actually, isn't it? Because this isn't just about people waving placards and cancelling speeches on campus. This is potentially a very serious physical assault.
No, exactly. I mean, it's, again, I think it just shows how dangerous a situation you create when you say that words are violence. I mean, when all those protested outside Netflix, that one of them said, we're not here because we can't take a joke, we're here because these jokes are taking lives. They see no distinction between an off-colour offensive joke and something which is actually like someone rushing you on stage. And I think whilst we're still waiting to find out what the particular details of this gentleman are and his intentions, it does add up to a kind of atmosphere in which you think people will start to take these actions, because they've taken on this idea that, you know, someone telling an offensive joke is like being punched in the face. And that's a really dangerous idea to take root, definitely.
Tom, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. So thank you for your wise insights and your comments and everything we've spoken about. If you want to hear more of Tom's wisdom, do log in to Spiked Online. It's a fantastic online magazine. I'd hugely recommend it. So get on your browser and Google that now. That's about all I've got time for. Join me again for We Need to Talk About on GB News. Same time, same place, 2 o'clock tomorrow. Coming up next, it's The Briefing with Darren McCaffrey. But first, let's have a little look at the weather. Fingers crossed.
Hello. Warmer weather is on the way, but today's a fairly cloudy one. Quite cool in most places, with some heavy showers, particularly in the east. Meanwhile, many western areas showing signs of brightening up as the afternoon wears on. Here's the big picture. High pressure is trying to move in, but these weather fronts are firmly controlling our weather today, bringing a lot of cloud and shunting showers eastwards. We're going to see 1 or 2 heavy ones this afternoon, most likely over northeast England, but also over the Midlands and drifting to East Anglia. The showers over eastern Scotland could be heavy, but they are fading here. Most of Scotland becoming dry this afternoon. Northern Ireland's mostly dry as well, with a fair bit of cloud. Some breaks in that cloud for Wales and southwest England, so a bit of sunshine here. Could see temperatures up to maybe 19 Celsius, but generally still on the cool side with temperatures in the mid-teens. And some quite heavy showers around this evening over southern parts of the Midlands, East Anglia, and 1 or 2 across the southeast as well. But those showers do fade through the night, so most places becoming dry overnight. Some patchy rain across the far northwest of Scotland. But for most, as I said, it becomes dry and clear and temperatures will drop down into single figures. A fine day for most then to come on Thursday. Could be a little bit of mist and fog early on here and there. We'll always keep a lot of cloud over western Scotland, rain at times over the Highlands, the Western Isles and the Northern Isles. Maybe 1 or 2 showers in southwest Scotland too. But for most places it's dry. Yes, it won't be blue skies everywhere, but most places will see some good spells of sunshine. And temperatures responding, finally getting back up to 20 degrees, maybe 21 across some parts of the south. cooler feel with the patchy rain across the northwest that persists during Thursday evening. If anything, it gets a bit heavier as weather fronts start to push in during Thursday night and Friday, and these weather fronts will bring some rain across the country on Friday. But after that, high pressure moves back in, and that should bring most of us a fine, bright weekend. Bye for now.
Millions of people across the UK are heading to the polls in a vital test of Boris Johnson's premiership. This isn't just about Westminster, these are local elections. A chance for you to decide how your community is run. We'll be talking to senior politicians, election analysts, our team of reporters around the country, and of course, to our team here in the studio. And we'll have comprehensive coverage of the elections to the Northern Irish Assembly. That's the UK Votes 2022 from 10 a.m. on Friday morning here on GB News, the People's News Channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover